welcome all of you to the first session here in the main hall. I am Niels Henrik Gregersen, and I'm president of the International Society of Science and Religion. And it's my pleasure that we are having this collaboration with ESSSAT, both on this session and also on at the book prize later in the week. I just want to introduce very briefly, for sake of time, the speakers. I'll begin with our first speaker, Fraser, who has a long history as a professor in psychology and also a lecturer in science and theology, as the Starbridge lecturer at Cambridge University, and he is a past president of the British Association for Psychology and also of ISSR, and is now working as the executive secretary for ISSR. And it's wonderful that you are here and will give your first presentation. So I hand over the word to you, Fraser, please.
Thanks for being here. It's a pleasure to be here at the ESSSAT conference, talking about the role of grand narratives in the sciences and the religious life. I'll pitch straight in. There's a need for critical perspectives on the categories of science and religion. And that's been reflected, for example, in a very sophisticated way in the work of Peter Harrison in the territories of science and religion. The various sciences are very different from one another, and there is no invariable essence of science or of religion. However, I would argue that there are family resemblances between the sciences and similarly the religious and spiritual traditions, though they vary a great deal from each other, there are significant family resemblances between them. So the terms science and religion are not so broad as to be meaningless. They're not identical terms. And it's better to talk about the sciences, plural, and religious and spiritual traditions rather than science and religion. The concepts of both science and religion, as we know them now, are products of the late 19th century, a period in which there was a huge amount of redrawing of conceptual categories. Science replaced natural philosophy, and religion came to mean something completely different from what it had meant for Aquinas or even for Calvin. And the concept of emotion also comes from that time, though emotions similarly differ very much from each other. So much for science and religion. Narrative. I accept that narratives about science and religion are often misleading, such as a conflict story. But I want to argue for the importance of grand narratives in the sciences and in the religious life. Narratives are not going to go away, nor should they, though they need to be handled with care and from a critical perspective. I don't see any prospect of human beings getting rid of narrative intelligence, even if we wanted to. There's no way in which people can develop meanings, make sense of their circumstances, without developing stories. Thomas Nagel famously argued that there's no view from nowhere. I would argue similarly that there's no understanding of human life, individual or cultural, without narrative. There is no view without narrative. And the ability to develop narratives is one of the more important accomplishments of human beings. There's a good book on this by Brian Boyd on the origins of stories. It began with the developing ability to understand sequences of events. And then with the addition of linguistic abilities, it led to the telling of stories. Storytelling has an interesting place in relation to the two main kinds of central intelligence found in human beings, conceptual intelligence and embodied intuitive intelligence. a distinction is roughly captured in the terms head and heart. Though narratives depend on linguistic abilities, they use those abilities in ways that reflect the strong connection of embodied intuitive intelligence with the body and with affect. In a similar way, John Teasdale, in a recent book on mindfulness, has argued that conceptual cognition is prosaic, whereas poetry is affective and evocative, and is better aligned with embodied intuitive cognition. Both stories and poetry have stronger affective connotations than dry, abstract conceptual cognition. Narrative intelligence is an important part of what it is to be a human person. We tell stories of different kinds from various sources in order to make sense of life. It's one of the kinds of intelligence that AI has not really yet got to grips with. And William Cloxin, a computer scientist himself, is very critical of much AI for its neglect of narrative intelligence, and sees the computational implementation of narrative intelligence as one of the major challenges facing AI. In the Christian tradition, there's a grand narrative about salvation, sometimes referred to as salvation history, which talks about an initial paradisal state curtailed through a fall and leading to a messianic hope, gradually building towards an eventual culmination. And within a broad scheme like that, the events and activities of particular individuals can be examined for how they advance or obstruct the working out of God's salvific purposes. Stories about particular local or personal events take on extra meaning and significance through being located within that kind of broad, grand narrative. Charles Eliot, in a fascinating book on memory and salvation, has drawn attention to the importance of this kind of crosstalk between different levels of narrative in the religious life. The Christian grand narrative of salvation history has become less dominant in Western culture than it used to be. But that hasn't led to an abandonment of grand narratives, but to their taking a different form. Grand narratives are now often derived from science, though serving a quasi-religious function as implicit religion. One of the first to draw attention to this was Stephen Toulmin, philosopher, in a long essay published back in 1957 and reproduced in his book, The Return to Cosmology. Toulmin's central point is that much scientific thinking goes beyond what can be concluded from scientific evidence and takes the form of myth in the technical sense of that word. Toulmin's particularly interested in cosmology, an area of science has become an arena in which metaphysical issues are framed and within which grand narratives are developed. In science, metaphysics and narrative often go together. Toulmin discusses the grand narrative about entropy and the anticipated inability of the universe to support life. And his point is that such a narrative is myth and goes far beyond what can properly be concluded from scientific evidence. Evolution and AI are other areas of science that are heavily metaphysical and give rise to grand narratives. There are many migrations of concepts going on. The Christian idea of original sin has resurfaced in 20th century scientific theorizing, in Freud's concept of the id, and in Richard Dawkins' concept of the selfish gene. And the theme of human rights that's come to play a central role in current social discourse seems to be a secularization of ideas that were originally grounded in the doctrine of people being created in the image of God. Mary Midgley, in the book Science of Salvation, referred to in the opening talk, has drawn attention to the broad narratives that often develop around science especially when science is popularized, and she comments on the wild speculation often found in the last chapter of popular books about science. What are theologians to make of this trend for religious salvation history to be replaced by quasi-religious myths derived from science? The key point I want to make here is that we don't have to choose between religious myths and myths derived from science. Religious myths can be reworked in connection with science-derived myths. And I'd argue that this is the most constructive response to the still widespread view that there's conflict between science and religion. It contrasts with the approach of Stephen Jay Gould, which argues that science and religion are fundamentally different activities. That approach ignores how much myth there is in scientific thinking and writing. And it's those areas of science that particularly give rise to myths and grand narratives that most lend themselves to the kind of integration of scientific and religious narratives for which I'm calling. In cosmology, much use has been made of the fine-tuning of the universe in developing a grand narrative about the universe that's both cosmological and religious. But the weakness of such integrations is that they often draw over-strong conclusions from fine-tuning, which largely ignore theologically inconvenient predictions about the far future of the universe. So far, evolution has probably been the most fruitful area of integration between religious and scientific narratives. And in my now quite old book, Theology and Psychology, I sketched out a version of Christian salvation history in dialogue with a theory of the evolution of human cognition, drawing on ideas from Owen Barfield and C.G. Jung, in which Christ is seen as a turning point in the evolution of human consciousness, or in what Jung might call the individuation of humanity as a whole. The theological response to AI has so far largely seen it as a threat, both to religious thinking about the human person and to humane forms of social life. But I'd argue that there's more scope for a fruitful integration of theology and AI than has so far been widely recognized. There were signs of such an integration developing in the 1960s between theology and cybernetics, for example, in the work of Stafford Beer. And more recently, my colleague Marius Dorobantu has argued for the important contribution AI can make to clarifying religious ideas, such as Imago Dei. To conclude, I've made two general points. First, I've drawn attention to the importance of narrative intelligence in human life and suggested it's an important feature of human intelligence and one that will always be with us. And secondly, with toolmen, I've acknowledged that in contemporary Western culture, the dominant grand narratives are ones that are often ostensibly derived from science rather than religion. And I've recognized such science-based narratives are more mythological and quasi-religious. But I've claimed that the scope for further fruitful work on the integration of those theological narratives with scientific grand narratives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fraser. Very interesting. Some of us may want to go straight into the discussion, but we will first, in the first hour, the ISSR hour, we will first hear Anthony and the response by Joanna. And Anthony is an assistant executive secretary to ISSR. And some of you will know him from all the material that he sends out to us. He's also a PhD candidate at York University in Toronto, working with Professor Bernard Leitman and working on the role of sciences and histories in popular literature. So please, Anthony.
Thanks, Niels. I'm not as young and sprightly as Fraser, so I'm going to remain seated, if that's okay with you. I just want to thank ESSAT for letting me ESSAT letting me speak here and letting ISSR be here together, and for Fraser for kind of working up a more broad overlay of what I'm going to be doing, which is focusing in on something particular within the current zeitgeist of our contemporary culture. One thing I would like to note is that work on popular narratives in the field of science and religion is surprisingly absent. I don't mean that they aren't present. I saw maybe one or two other presentations here that speak to popular narratives, and by this I mean the thing that is coming out of popular culture, or what we can put in the package of popular culture. My concern is with the stuff of popular narratives, specifically with regards to science and religion. Discussions outside of the academy are especially what interests me. That in the popular mind and everyday thought. It's crucial to recognize that academic work, particularly in science, has grown increasingly tense within popular culture, probably since around 2014 if we take Jonathan Haidt's claim at NYU. And unfortunately, the academy often dismisses popular culture as a source of misinformation or something not worthy of our attention for whatever reason that may be. And this, I claim, is a missed opportunity. I aim to persuade you that science, religion, popular culture, and narrative deserve serious investigation across the various methods present here today in this room, whether that be qualitative, quantitative, theoretical, historical, philosophical, sociological, psychological, and of course, theological. Given your familiarity with the field, I won't dwell on the thoroughly debunked conflict thesis popularized by Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper in the late 19th century. However, it's worth noting that this thesis strongly holds over the popular mind. If you ever have a dinner conversation with people outside of the academy, they will often dive into how science and religion are incompatible. Even though there are numerous works, some even aimed at the general educated populace by James Ngunnero, Ron Numbers, Fred Nelson Baker, Bernard Lightman, Elaine Howard Eckler, some of you in this room, etc., etc. These academic insights have failed to penetrate the popular mind. The persistence of this conflict myth is not surprising. Think of the academy. History, at least in the North American context, is often sidelined in the university today. Some universities are even abandoning history altogether. There's articles recently in The Guardian about how the humanities has a place in the university and we shouldn't defund them. Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario recently scrapped the entirety of the humanities school. Those history programs that do exist, enrollment is low. General survey courses, while their enrollment is high, often skim over the history, perpetuating conflict narratives, which is made very clear by Tom Atchner's work. Galileo and Darwin still hold a space within the conflict narrative. It's the history and philosophy of science, though, that is a fertile ground for exploring the role of narrative in science's history. Since the late 18th century, scientific narratives have been developed. Scientific narratives like Friedrich Schilling's Natural Philosophy, sorry for my brutal pronunciation there, which reflects an early grand narrative of science motivated by German Romanticism, is such an example. And yet more emerged in the 19th century. James Secor's Victorian Sensation reveals how science narratives, here in Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, by Robert Chambers, created a sensation that changed Victorian norms and customs. These narratives, labeled epics of evolution, were structured to enhance engagement, understanding, and impact using storytelling techniques like plot, pace, rhetorical devices like metaphors, in order to make complex ideas accessible and, importantly, to reveal how a grand narrative of science, in this case, in the case of the epic of evolution, reveals the work of God. But the shift in religious affiliation in recent years is something that we shouldn't ignore. As seen in census data, I focus mostly on what Charles Taylor calls the North Atlantic West. As seen in census data from Canada, England, and Wales, There's a significant change in the spiritual makeup of the North Atlantic West here. Religious affiliation is declining. Elaine Howard Eklund's work, which found that a notable portion of scientists identify as spiritual but not religious, indicates a growing interest in finding spiritual outlets that align with material worldviews. This trend likely extends to the broader public and suggests a shift towards finding meaning in other sources, like science-derived grand narratives. There's something to the fact that Carl Sagan, who we'll get to briefly, is largely credited by many practicing scientists today as the motivation for joining science or pursuing science professionally. So one thing that I do in my work is I try to understand the social and cultural mechanisms at play that may have allowed or kind of point towards what is the reason for this? Why is a grand narrative science, even though some decry it as not providing the same stuff of religion, why is it able to do that? Well, to start, everyone's probably likely heard of The Disenchantment from Max Weber, and maybe even the secularization work of Charles Taylor. I think this may provide a theoretical foundation for understanding this shift. Secularization, Weber claims, is the shift from mystery and magical elements, broadly speaking, obviously those terms are a little bit contentious, to the rationalization of all things. And Taylor argues that through centuries of political, cultural, and scientific developments, concepts that have been the realm of the transcendent become replaced by those of their secular counterparts. This created a new understanding of self and the world, where religion becomes one option among many. And remember the census data. We went from being a porous self to a buffered self, Taylor claims. While science is apparently incapable of developing a worldview analogous to religion, some claim, I argue that this is not the case, and that science can be shaped into a narrative, a grand narrative that reoccupies the metaphysical positions traditionally held by religion. Hans Blumenberg's concept of reoccupation, a German philosopher of metaphor, helps us to understand how secular narrative science can offer alternative sources of meaning and enchantment. The grand cosmic narrative, as I'm kind of calling it right now, as seen in the television program from 1980, Cosmos, A Personal Voyage, provides that source of meaning in a secular age. The metaphysical answer position, say, of the Christian religion has in many ways been reoccupied by the findings on display in the program Cosmos. This show offers a way of seeing the world and understanding humanity's place in it, providing ethical guidance and a sense of connection to the universe, a way with dealing with each other and the planet. This may be, in fact, a small piece of the puzzle as to why climate anxiety is so prominent among Gen Z and Alpha. There's a disconnect between these grand narratives. My object of study, as I briefly mentioned, is Carl Sagan and Andrean's Cosmos series, which they began writing in 1976. They developed a program that combined science communication with grand narrative structure that offered something unique, a comprehensive worldview from a secular perspective. The grand cosmic narrative, which is what I explore, offers a secular creation story derived from scientific understanding. It builds the ethical and moral frameworks, urges that meaning can be found in the natural world, the pursuit of knowing the natural world, and understanding the principles of science in order to respect the world and each other. It presents a grand narrative that intertwines scientific knowledge, ethical considerations, wonder, but more importantly, the stories of the humans and the cultures of the world. It situates the viewer in space and time, giving them a direction from which to go from. The series uses digital effects heavily. It actually had an $8 million budget in 1980, which was unprecedented for the time. And it uses metaphors like the cosmic calendar and the ship of the imagination to help viewers grasp the immensity of time and space. Ethos, pathos, and logos are used to enhance the effectiveness of the communication. Visual rhetoric, which did play a significant role in the Victorian age, gets renewed here for the digital age. The screen becomes a portal to the universe, to new understandings, to shared values, an area ripe for further exploration in science and religion. The narrative of Cosmos tells the story of humanity's place within and connection to the universe. But it is not only about the universe, it is about us. The grand cosmic narrative defines a narrative, a form of science that presents a secular creation story with moral propositions. This narrative emphasizes that connectivity to one another, to the universe, to the physical and chemical processes of the universe at large. And it urges an orientation towards life as a gift of deep time, to the natural processes of chance circumstances, not something to dread, but something to embrace. It offers a framework for understanding humanity's place in this universe, and more importantly, it offers a way forward for a planet doomed either through nuclear destruction or climate change. Now, why is this significant? Well, Cosmos has reached over 1 billion people, probably more now since the 2021 program Possible Worlds came out. And this is just an illustration of the power popular culture has in shaping public thought. If you scroll Instagram, for example, and search hashtag Carl Sagan, you'll get millions of hits of Carl Sagan in some kind of ethereal form. Interestingly, and this is worth more exploration, is that Carl Sagan's hashtag is most predominantly used in South America. This may have something to do with the empirical religion, I forget the name of it, but the empirical religion down there that they developed in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. Popular culture, defined by its mass appeal and economic and communicative considerations, I claim is a valuable resource for studying creators and audience thoughts and attitudes, especially when it comes to science and religion. I have attempted here to introduce the importance of popular narratives at the intersection of science, religion, and popular culture. Popular culture, shaped by its cultural and historical context, offers a wealth of resources, relatively untapped here, for studying how narratives of science and religion are formed and consumed. Understanding these narratives opens new avenues for reshaping public perceptions of relationships between science and religion, using the tools available from departments such as popular culture studies. Perhaps we can actually challenge enduring myths, such as the conflict thesis, and discover and relish, perhaps, new sources of spiritual nourishment in our secular age. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And the last speaker in this first hour, it will be Joanna Leidenhag, who is Associate Professor in Philosophy and Theology at Leeds, and who is also known to all of us as the ESSSAT Vice President for Publications. Thank you. Please.
Thank you very much. Obviously, first, thank you to ISSR for the invitation to be on this panel and respond to these two excellent papers. I'm going to start off actually with Anthony's paper because I read it first. And when I then turned to read Fraser's paper, I had that, experience I'm sure many of us have had, where you realize everything you wanted to say in response had already been said by the other presenter. But I'll start off with Anthony, and a word of appreciation for pointing us and encouraging us to focus more of our scholarly attentions on popular culture. I do actually think that the field of science and religion has been slightly better at this than many other fields, certainly than other fields I participate in, such as systematic theology and philosophical theology, where there's almost no engagement at all with popular culture. And there is actually quite a lot, I think, in science and religion. Indeed, as you gestured towards at this conference, we have whole sessions dedicated to science fiction novels, to movies, and to poetry and photography and music and opera. But you push us even further, I think, in your use of the word stuff, the stuff of popular culture, the stuff of narratives. to think sociologically, to think about the materials that we use, the magazines, the posters, the art installations, indeed also to think about the way institutions shape us and shape our movements, shape our bodies, and shape the stuff with which we think. And obviously you spend detailed attention looking at Carl Sagan's Cosmos. I wasn't born when Cosmos was aired on the television, so if I'm honest, I'm not particularly familiar with it, but I am very familiar with, I think, a comparable example, which would be David Attenborough's various series of Planet Earth, Blue Planet, Green Planet. Friends will know I'm totally obsessed with Green Planet in particular. It's definitely his best. You should all watch it. Which, although seems to focus just on our little Earth, starts off with this grand epic soundtrack taken of the Earth from outside of space with the sun rising in the background, very much a cosmic narrative, just as much as Cosmos, I think. And this brings us, I think, to a consideration of what I would call a theology of science communication. What do I mean by this? I mean, well, we all know roughly what science communication is. We were learning about it from Dr. Colt earlier this morning. But a theology of science communication might be able to think about what theological analysis might bring, not just to the pursuit of science in its methods in laboratories or out in oceans and fields, but also in the theological analysis of the way that science is communicated to the broader public. In many ways, this is, I think, what Anthony and Fraser are already offering us today. What kind of theology of language, or what might we take from the field of theology of language, the way metaphor and analogy works, that can be applied to help us understand the way that language is being used in science communication? We might think of theology of the arts, the way that images are used, iconography, and such like, to think about the way that images are portrayed in reference to the evolution of our life on our planet and across the universe and various other scientific topics. A great example of this comes from the work of Mary Midgley, who has been referenced already twice this morning, as well as Lisa Sidiris in relation to ecology and the way that religious myth-making works in ecological narratives of our time. This brings me to already an overlap, therefore, with Fraser's paper, who started off with a recognition of Peter Harrison's work and of the complicated nature of the word science of religion, science on one hand, and religion on the other, which is an area that my work has focused in under the heading of science-engaged theology. But I think we need to push further than merely a kind of gesture or recognition of this complicated, blurred boundary, because I think it really still problematizes the ideas of reoccupying narratives, as Anthony said, or of science-derived narratives or quasi-religious functions of science, as Fraser said. I think when we really think about the complicated overlap between science and religion, the fact that there is no clear boundary marker between them, it's very difficult to know when one starts and the other finishes, that phrases like derived from or beyond scientific evidence, although they come off the tongue quite easily, become very difficult to really know what we're talking about. What does beyond science mean? Where does it end and something else begin? What does derived from science mean if the derived from science is already a religious narrative or a quasi-religious narrative? When we zoom in, there really is no clear demarcation, only gradients of gray. This might sound like I'm just stirring the pot, making trouble, and problematizing my colleagues' work, but offering nothing positive in return. I don't want to do that. I want to indeed suggest that rather than throwing up our hands and saying, well, we can't even use these words anymore, this is all a lost cause, instead that we might think of our task slightly differently, as instead of bringing something called science together with something called religion, as if these things already existed independent of each other, which I think they don't, just seeing our task merely as more of a PR exercise, as bringing to the surface of engaging with publics as best we can to make them aware of how these two things already exist together and never existed apart. Thus, when we think about the religious connotations or the religious meaning of various what we call scientific work, that doesn't mean we're discrediting the scientific work in any way or whatever else the implication might be of that for some of our publics, but instead that we are giving it, in fact, full human holistic attention and suggesting that it's important. So I think our task as science and religion scholars is more of a PR exercise sometimes than anything else. Okay, this brings me finally to two questions I have for you. Rather than just sharing my own thoughts, I should hand the mic back over. So two questions for my colleagues. A question that occurred to me when reading both these papers was, in what sense does talking about narrative immediately imply that we're talking about religion? Or perhaps put this another way, does religion have a monopoly on narrative? When we talk about scientific narrative, I find an impulse immediately to think, well, that makes it religious or quasi-religious. But then I immediately thought, well, historians have narrative. Literary scholars are probably in charge of narrative if we were to give someone that job. And yet, I do think that when we talk about narrative, at least in my perspective as a theologian, I almost think this becomes a religious monopoly. But I'm not comfortable with that thought. So I wanted to ask both of you, in what sense does talking about the narratives of science and scientific communication automatically make it religious or not? And finally, there are some really important narratives that I think are dominating the North Atlantic West, which were absent from our conversation. Post-colonial narratives, feminist narratives, narratives coming out of critical race theory, which problematize both the legacies of science and of religion, in particular Christianity, and which seem to be increasingly important in meaning-making today amongst particularly younger generations. When I think of the students I teach, these are the narratives they know, not the narratives of either Christianity, of which they know next to nothing, or indeed many of the narratives of science, of which their literacy might be lower than expected. But the narratives of post-colonialism, the narratives of feminism, the narratives of queer theory, these are the narratives that dominate their lives. And I feel like we also need to be paying attention to those narratives. And I'm wondering what place you see of that in the arguments that you're making, perhaps in relation to cosmos or in relation to evolutionary psychology. Thank you very much.
Thank you.